Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the ninth episode of Retuning Your Firm. I'm delighted to have a really great panel today. So I hope some of you enjoyed the informal networking in Remo. It's a really fun place if you've not had a chance to do that. So I would really encourage you to take a look at that. So what are we doing today? We've got three themes that we're really looking at in a bit more depth. We're looking at the environmental, social, and governance agenda, which has almost sort of replaced CSR in many organizations. We're looking at the value of management discipline and the extent to which being disciplined can actually help with your profitability. And lastly, and in a way, quite interesting, we've spent a lot of money on technology. How effective has that expenditure been? How are we going to measure the success of our technology investments? So those are our three themes for today. And I'd like to introduce you to our panel. So in order of appearance, firstly, Francesca Lagerberg. I'll put them all up. Sorry, they're out of order today. It's mine. So we've got Cameron Ireland, who's the Chief Executive Officer of Boardex. Lisa Lister, who's the Director of Progress Marketing. Sebastian Hartmann from Global Head of Technology Strategy for KPMG. Our anchor tenant, Francesca, who we always love to have on the show. And obviously yours truly, founder Chief Executive Managing Partners Forum. So that's our today's panel in order of appearance. And let's just run through some of these strategies that I think are really helpful as sort of set the agenda, if you like, when you're thinking about retuning your firm. First of all, think big. Believe 6 impossible things before breakfast, as Lewis Carroll said memorably. Remember that actually you are the power of your relationships, and therefore the key is not just to collect an address book, but actually to reciprocate favors. Think small. You've got to focus on the angles that will really resonate with your key audiences. It could be your people, it could be your clients. It doesn't matter. Unless you're in alignment with what they want, you will probably go off-piste, and that's not a good place to be. Think about doing campaigns rather than one-offs, because actually at the end of the day, that's what really converts the audience into a community. You're going to have to drop the convention. We're all experimenting and playing with new ideas and services. A few months ago, everybody was looking at new business models. That may have gone off the agenda now because that's kind of a tough one, but new ideas, that's important. And we as a sector are very good at ideas. That's why clients use us, I suspect, as much as anything else. Speed is of the essence. Yeah, we're going to be in a space at one stage where people are saying, oh, that's enough change for me. But actually, the reality is you have to be quite rigorous about how you actually both articulate and market test your assumptions. And like any scientific experiment, if they prove invalid, and they will, many of them, then you need to amend and go in a different direction. And the good thing about that approach is it depersonalizes it. You don't get the people on the board saying, this is my strategy to the same extent, because the assumptions are actually what drives it. And if, particularly for the accountants, as we well know as an accountant, you change your assumptions, you change your profit numbers. It's very simple. And finally, be entrepreneurial, keep listening and innovating. And lots of people, when they're thinking about entrepreneurship, focus on the last word, innovating. What they kind of forget is that actually the listening part of it is even more important than the innovating part. So if you're not listening, then as again, you will end up going off piste, and I wouldn't recommend that. So thanks to Elena Kudsko of Globsec back in April, that was still using it. It's a lovely, lovely set of strategies. And I think if you keep those in mind, that will really help you go in a good direction as a firm. So let's go back and look. What did we say last week in the tracker? Let's run through last week's poll. Let's look at what were the results. Well, the first thing that I think is really interesting is that the level of dip over the next 6 months back in April was 7%, and it's now up to 21%. That's firms who are saying that there will be no dip. That for the last couple of months now, the 10% has stayed at about 50%. And if you then switch over to the 30% or more, what was north of 50% has now dropped back into low teens. So what the sectors are now saying to us is that they think that the level of dip is going to be round about 7%. That's kind of the number that's kind of people are holding in when they're doing their forward planning. Now, what's quite interesting is that I think is a little bit lower than possibly people thought it might be a month ago. Now they've had a month to do some thinking. So whilst if you look at this kind of more expansion versus contraction, now clearly, in a way, a modest reduction in perceived income is going to be a contraction. So again, one has to be a little bit careful how one interprets this. But what is very clear is that the percentage of firms that are looking to contract over the next year is about half. And the ones who are looking to expand is a very small, low teens again. And obviously the ones in the middle are those who perceive neither contraction nor expansion. And the same pretty much applies if you look at the level of headcount. nearly touching last month, but now diverging. And actually, if you then look at new workflow, it's actually the line's gone back. So we kind of got a quite. I was trying to think of something to describe the image, and I gave up. But you can kind of see where I'm coming from. It can't really make its mind up, basically, I guess you could say. So that's about the new workflow. I shouldn't be trivializing it. It's important stuff. In terms of priorities, what's really fascinating to me here, and it's a really busy chart, so don't try and take it all in, but over on the far left, alter your business model. Now, again, it's probably not very obvious to see, but back in April, that was actually top of the list. And now come September, end of August, it's actually bottom of the list. Because I think people have kind of said, going back to this 30% dip, oh my God, we're going to have to reinvent our business. They've realized it's not quite so bad after all. So they're actually not thinking about having to alter the business model, because as anybody's ever looked into that, will realize it's not much fun. The one that has kind of taken the slack, if you like, is develop a clear purpose and strategy. In other words, absolutely clear what you're doing. Operational efficiency is now up to 2/3. That's massively important for people as well. And the rest kind of fall in between. Now, what's also quite interesting, if you go back to the orange one in February, fundamentally, that chart hasn't changed. In other words, despite COVID, despite lockdown, actually business priorities fundamentally have stayed the same. And that's, I guess, suggests that either people are being groupthink or myopic, or actually no, we had some good strategies and good priorities to begin with, but we just need to roll them out in a slightly different way. What's getting in the way? This is quite interesting. The one that has come from nowhere since February is the financial health of your clients. I mean, that was wouldn't even bother to put it in the list back in February. It just wasn't even on the agenda. Now, getting on for 2/3 of people are saying that's one of the 3 constraints that's holding them back. And the poor economic outlook's pretty much doubled. What on the other side? Well, employee turnover was 25%, now 0. And equally, the whole issue around skills and talent, 36%, now down to 7. In other words, the whole agenda is shifted in terms of what's getting in the way. It's nothing to do really with your people or the skills as it was in terms of how do we cope with the demand, because everybody, if you recall, 80% of people were expecting to be growth back in February, but now it's all around economic outlook and the financial health of the client base. So that's kind of interesting as well. This one won't surprise you, but it's pretty stark. General mood amongst people over returning to the office. Yeah, there was a slight improvement over the last month, but pretty minor, quite frankly. The gap is still 60%. It was 80, but it hasn't fundamentally changed since the end of May. And it's kind of, all right, there was a bit of a bounce towards the end of July, and everyone was even more nervous as a result of going back to the office, but now it's settled. So general mood, and when I'm talking to firms, they're kind of telling me, yeah, about 10% of people are back at any point in time, often on a rota basis. Our capacity is probably about 30-40%. The others, we couldn't fit them in anyway, and there's no pressure on people to go back. And I think, as Lisa will explain a little bit later, that isn't the same in the manufacturing world at all. So where they've had to be back at the office the whole time, so to speak. So it'll be interesting to hear her thoughts on that from a regional perspective in particular. What about the people working from home? Are there any fundamental differences there? Well, what we're kind of seeing there is it's kind of nudging slightly more. The blue is September, slightly closer to the around half. There isn't the percentage of firms where everybody's back in the office, 3%, 4%, trivial. The percentage where everyone's still working from home, about 20%, that hasn't really shifted. So there's been a sort of movement slightly between the around 3/4 and around half. But if you do the math, the huge percentage of firms are going to be having considerably less than half their people in the office at the end of this year. Obviously, we'll see how it goes. Now in Germany, and Sebastian can help us on this because he's based there, those numbers are somewhat different. As I understand, 85% is probably more like the sort of extent to which people in Germany are back in the office in amongst knowledge workers. So again, we may explore that a bit later in the show. What about how's that impacting? Again, there's kind of 2 agendas going on here. About half the people, 40%, say about the same level of office space needed, and about another 40% or so saying we want 20% or even greater less space, and there's a few in the 10%, but it's mostly it seems more binary, that one. Yeah, on the whole, we're either going to stay as we are or we're going to cut about 20%, and that may well depend on leases coming up for renewal, etc., etc. And the last one, and this may help us in our conversations today, is what are the things that actually are being talked about in the partner direct discussions? What are the things that people are really focused on? And again, cash flow was just absolutely critical back in August. It's dropped back a little bit, but it's still the big item. Anything to do with going to the bottom, how we spend our money, like the supply chain, where you can actually have a big increase on impact on the cash flow, isn't considered important. We'll be doing an ESG poll shortly. Sustainability and corporate citizenship isn't really appearing on the agenda for firms in terms of the top three. I'm not saying it isn't covered, but the top three. And the other ones kind of, again, there's no real changes. The people agenda's gone up a little bit, as has the client side, and the performance and the marketing piece appear to have gone down a little bit. But again, month on month, I don't think those are massive shifts, so it's hard to draw any major conclusions there. But broadly, the things that really count in partner discussions are cash flow, cash flow, people, and clients. And I guess, again, is that new? Not really. It's just the cash flow is probably a bit higher at the moment. Yet, as we know from the banks, actually the firms have got a lot of cash at the moment. They're well managed. Generally, because of the LLP structure, they've been able to cut the cash payments to partners easily, much easier than a PLC could. And actually, they're more worried, as somebody pointed out, the key era, the tough era 10 years ago was not 2008, but 2010. In other words, it's a year or two out that when actually you're going to need that cash, because that's when some of these projects or some of the clients have health cash problems, etc., etc. Anyway, that's a really quick run through some of the findings that we came up to. Obviously, shared with government as usual, and other people who are interested in those particular findings. So, thank you to everybody on the call who completes them. Feedback from the government on our polls, which well, these words speak for themselves. So. I can't do more than say that we'll keep trying, and the only way I can do that is by encouraging you to complete the poll now. What we're trying to do here is look at ESG. Now, that isn't necessarily an acronym that everybody's familiar with in a partnership world. CSR is one that's probably more common, but actually ESG is much more a strategic focus around not just doing something, but actually then publishing it or bringing it to the attention of investors to help them do more precise assessments when actually doing sustainable and impact investment, sorry. So something that Cameron knows a lot about, and we'll be sharing some thoughts on that. But the criteria, I think, are equally relevant for partnerships, particularly around reputation management. And what we're trying to do in here is to find out the extent to which firms are actually measuring and sharing their activities in a way that have a positive impact on, obviously, the usual suspects: invest, employees, clients, environment, and of course the wider community. So the CSR agenda is kind of there, but this is much more a measurement and sharing angle rather than are you doing it, but not much is happening sort of thing in terms of anybody else being aware of it. Because at the end of the day, reputation is as much as anything else, not just what you do, but how you share it with others to make sure they're aware of what you're doing. So I'll go through them so it gives him more time to think. And so, is there a dedicated committee or specialist to advise on environmental, social and governance policies at your firm? About half, yes. And about half say no, and there's no plan to do so. So, and a few are thinking about it, but it's a minor, 10% are just sort of thinking about something in between. So there's a bit of a sort of, yes, we have it, or no, we don't, bit of a binary going on there. So now we go into the detailed ones. First of all, this is the environmental questions. So to what extent is the firm switching to renewable or clean sources of energy? About a third are not seeing this as important. About another third are saying we're doing something, but not really measuring it. And then a few people are measuring, and where they are, it's obviously sometimes, and again, there's 3 levels of measurement: one of sharing, one is with the partners and senior management, that's 17% or so, one is with their people, and the last one is externally, which in practice probably means clients and other key audiences of the firm. So again, those are the same options in terms of the answers for all of them as you will have found when you were doing them. So that's the question of renewables. When it then comes to conserving resources and minimizing pollution, this one, that is seen as a high priority, and there is efforts are being made, but in terms of the measurement of performance, that is being shared with your people as well, unlike the previous one, if you recall, where it was clean source of energy was a lower one. And on the third one, in terms of going carbon, 20% not a priority, about 40% saying yep, no measurement. Yes, we're doing it, but not really measuring it. And a similar sort of percentages sharing it, both with their partners, people, and a much smaller number externally, 7% small. What about measuring satisfaction levels? Yep, on the whole, everybody sees that as a priority, which is good. Everybody's doing it, but the biggest one is performance is being measured and data is shared with our people, 50%, but only 7% are actually bothering to share that with clients. Now, is that an issue? Let's explore that one a bit further, because at the end of the day, if your clients aren't sure that you're going to be deploying positive, engaged people, they may end up with suboptimal project outcomes from your input. So there's an option that you need to think about there. In terms of health and well-being, again, almost nobody's sharing that externally at all. Yes, it's happening, but not much measurement. Everyone sees it a priority. I think that's obvious. Health and well-being is, but again, that one is being shared with people, but not externally. And again, the whole point about ESG, if you recall, was external investors assessing companies. So that's really where that agenda comes from, which makes it much more strategic. Gender diversity inclusiveness, almost similar sorts of, a little bit more externally being shared there. I think possibly the gender issue has crept up with Black Lives Matter and other similar campaigns. So that one, I think probably people are now more comfortable and see the need to share externally. Now let's talk about optics, because I really don't know where this one is going to be, where this one's coming up, because it's an interesting question. It's this: to what extent are the optics associated with the compensation levels of your employees being measured and shared at your firm? So it's not, do you know how much you're paying people? Of course you do. But are you actually thinking about the impact, the optics associated with that? And again, what you're seeing here is that, yes, it is being measured, but only at best. It's either just being no measurement at all, or it's only being shared with the partners. So in other words, yeah, they're collecting some data around perceptions of the firm, but they're not actually telling their people or people externally. So they're allowing the external perception to own the agenda effectively, rather than trying to influence it, which again, from a marketing point of view, I think it's a bit of a missed opportunity there. Lisa may have a view as a marketing expert. Again, looking at another area of optics, compensation levels of partners, which obviously, you know, the legal mags rush to jump all over and talk about, but to what extent is that sort of, are these optics actually being shared? And the answer is not really, just within the partnership effectively. And for some people, it's not, a quarter of people, it's not seen as a priority. However much you happen to pay yourselves is, well, that's a private matter, I guess. And that's fine if that's the way people feel. And when it then lastly comes to the diversity of the board, executive and management committees, and the extent to which those optics are being, yeah, there's no real measurement of it for most firms. But there is a bit more of an external sharing of that one, because on the whole, people do want, a bit like we picked up with Black Lives Matter and diversity. So this is seen to be, I guess, part of the same thing. So anyway, that's my kind of run through of the results, which hopefully has given Cameron some time to reflect on them. So I'll now stop sharing and I will hand over to Cameron.
Great, thanks very much, Richard. As you can see, I was busy scribbling down the results, and forgive me if I've got some of them wrong. I'm just not that fast a writer. So I'm going to touch upon a couple of things in the time I've got, but to give you some context, we work across the professional services and financial services segments in particular, also including the executive search communities. And we've seen a number of things happen over the course of the last 9 months as the pandemic has taken its grip. ESG is such a large subject. I'm only going to touch upon 3 areas, and briefly at that, but obviously happy to take questions after the session. So, you know, the first and probably one of the biggest that we are involved in is all around diversity. It started off with the focus around gender diversity and working with clients and, in fact, partners to ask the question, what is actually being done? Now, as everyone is aware, it is very much in the news. Gender diversity has been very, very important for many years. And now there is much more of a focus around diversity, particularly for ethnic minorities, but also in other areas as well. So one of the things that we've been looking at and working on is, how do you promote change? Because I think the emphasis that we get from our clients and the people we talk to is, it's very easy to talk about it. It's less easy to actually put practical steps in place to enable companies or organizations to effect change. And it's our belief that you have to start not only at the top, but also at the bottom. So clearly, any change will be driven by the board and the leadership team, and part and parcel of that in terms of the survey around the last question. You know, the diversity of board and the leadership team, the executive committees and the management team, you know, how diverse is it? Unless you are seeing change there, it won't start to filter down the rest of the organization. But at the same time, how are you going to look after those people just starting those careers or are in middle management and looking to move on? So we are seeing many companies now putting policies in place to try and affect change. In fact, being part of Euromoney, that is one of the things that we are doing. And certainly one of the big indicators for us, particularly from a governance standpoint, would be, you know, the formation of a diversity and inclusion committee, focusing not just on diversity, but also inclusion. It neatly leads into another aspect that I think doesn't make a lot of surprising news around social mobility, but it's still a point, which is educational, intellectual diversity across your company. I'm sure, as we all know, you know, there has been a tendency in the past that you don't have that intellectual diversity necessarily, and that can stifle the growth. Why is this important? Well, you need to be able to share thoughts and processes from people of many different backgrounds. So promoting social mobility is critically important. And again, companies we are seeing are beginning to promote that by forming dedicated committees with people that have experience in that. So they are actively looking at people's backgrounds to say, well, where you come from? You know, how can we help you if you're coming from a disadvantaged background? And the final area that I wanted to touch upon is climate change, because actually it all pulls everything together as far as I'm concerned. You know, we're all seeing the terrible wildfires that are going on in California, and you know, many of my friends and colleagues are actually based on the West Coast, and I get some really horrible stories about how they're having to deal with it. But at the end of the day, you know, the commentary around is this to do with climate change is becoming more and more impactful. Indeed, one of the individuals that I used to work with, he's a senior journalist, has now started writing a column about climate change. And we are actively trying to work with organizations like Chapter Zero to promote the need for climate change. So what does that mean from a board standpoint? Well, really, it's helping non-executive directors understand what tools are out there to help them affect change. Because it's very easy to say, oh, well, you know, as a strategy, we're going to do this. But unless you have guidance and assistance and advice, then organizations like Chapter Zero can really help. And more importantly, they're global in nature. So what are we doing around it? Well, from my perspective, it's about collaboration and partnerships, which in a pandemic world means that events like this, where we're networking remotely for the first time and not doing it face to face, become very, very important. You reach out to people, you're not afraid to do so, and you absolutely persevere in building those relationships to help change within the ESG environment. I notice I'm running out of time, so happy to take any questions after that, and I hope that opens it up for discussion a little later. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you, Cameron. That was really great. And I think the way it brings together climate change and everything that's going on in California, horrible as that is, with something that is relevant to the board agenda is something that people don't always realize, quite the connection that exists between those two. Lisa. Lisa was on the show many, many months ago. So some of you may recall, but she, if you is a dedicated marketing consultant, but she also runs a number of, I think, half a dozen leadership groups based in Yorkshire, bringing together leaders not just of professional firms but also of manufacturing and other industries. And I thought it'd be really interesting just to get a sense as to what are the issues that are going on in the minds of the leaders of smaller organizations regionally in the UK, both in the professional services but also in the manufacturing sector. Over to you, Lisa.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you for having me back, and good morning, everybody. So as Richard mentioned, up in Yorkshire, I've been running a lot more leadership groups during lockdown, unsurprisingly, sometimes mixed with engineering, manufacturing and professional services. And there definitely is a divide in kind of thinking, I think, there, which we can touch on maybe later. But we have one dedicated Yorkshire lawyer leadership group that's been running for about 9 years now. And we met more in lockdown, and I think the members really valued that that sense checking actually more than anything else, because certainly at the beginning it was all a bit frightening, I think. So just by way of context, a lot of those firms are more traditional high street firms, and they've got quite a lot of private clients. So a lot of family, wills and probate and conveyancing, as well as the corporate side of things. I think the overarching theme, when Richard asked me to sort of summarise how the sentiments up here, the overarching theme I kind of came up with is flex. That's what it feels like. Had to be an awful lot of flex in different disciplines. So flex in terms of the working patterns, which I know you've discussed a lot here. One of the members, Paul Berwin, said the phrase, and I like it because it's a very simple phrase, but very difficult to do. People are the most effective when they work in the way that's most effective for them. So we had lots of stories about older partners still turning up at the office, huddled away in their office, and nobody daring to tell them that actually there was a lockdown and they were supposed to be at home. And equally, lots of people thriving and being really productive remotely. But how much of a challenge that is to be able to get that agility in a firm to accommodate that type of sort of flexibility of working patterns. And there are some models that are coming in with, a couple of core days and then a floater day and then some days at home, really changing the hours so that people can miss the commutes and come in much earlier and leave much later. So that's definitely kind of starting, but that's a big mindset change for everybody. So there's flex in the working patterns. Interestingly, one of the members mentioned the kind of flex in the leadership style. Obviously, generally professional services, it's very consensus driven, coaching, quite gentle, not so much micromanaging, no dictatorial approach. But during lockdown, certainly at the beginning, people just looked to the leaders and they wanted something much stronger, much more direct. And the people who were the best communicators were the ones that were seen as the better leaders. Now we're getting to a stage where that's having to be pulled back again. It was needed for a few months, but people wouldn't want that permanently, I don't think. So flex in the style. In terms of the headlines, actually, Richard, the poll there about what people are talking about in the board meetings, it really did mirror our group. So on the plus side, actually turnover in lots of those firms seemed to be up and back the same or better than they were before lockdown commenced. Probably skewed a little bit by the conveyancing, residential conveyancing. Most of those departments have nearly doubled in size. Some of the firms saying that they're back because of that, and the combination of really getting a grip of their operational efficiencies, which obviously again came in high in this poll. They have massively reduced their overheads. I think one mentioned around a 50 grand saving in a very small firm just on going pay polite. I think what that highlighted to them was actually probably these things should have been done earlier, but hey ho, they've been done now. So they're kind of, the profitability is definitely up. So they're all good things. I think the hardest firms, the struggle was with multi-offices. One of the firms has around 15 offices. Operational efficiencies, obviously the challenge is there, but the biggest gains are to be made there, I think. I think where they got a little bit lapsed, if they're being really honest, was on debtor days for a little while, because they were wanting to be sensitive and gentle with their clients, and they've kind of had to clamp down on that again. And maybe, Sebastian, this might be interest you on the sort of security side. Yes, all those processes and systems were implemented at home, but maybe without there were a few gaps, shall we say. So I think that security has been tightened up again. I think another positive is the looking at clients from a client care perspective rather than a case perspective, and that's been a positive to help widen those types of nurturing conversations that happen with clients. In terms of moving forwards, I think the balance now is between, yes, you're productive working from home, but we're missing that culture and that fuel, the positive fuel that you get from being in the office and kind of bouncing off each other. So I think, and that's going to continue with that sort of juggling of balls, if you like, particularly with lots of my manufacturers. They've kind of got everybody in, and then within a few days from schools going back, all the self-isolations happened again in the quarantine, and it's going to be a lot of toing and froing, I think, now in decision making. And that's going to be tricky. But again, I think the leaders have learned a lot more of that flex, and therefore should be well placed to be able to cope with that. So a positive slant, I think, from the Yorkshire region. I feel a bit like the Eurovision when you I'm calling him from Luxembourg. But yeah, no, a positive slant from the Yorkshire region, I think.
Thanks, Lisa. That was really helpful. I know we sometimes get ourselves into a place where we think everything is bad, and actually, no, there are some positives. And putting a bit of management discipline into a firm that was possibly run a little bit more like a community at times does actually help a lot. Sebastian's our next speaker. Now, Sebastian is, let's give his job title, Global Head of Technology Strategy at accountancy firm KPMG. Only a firm of the size of KPMG would probably have somebody in such a position. For most people, they've got a CIO, and that's about it. But I think Sebastian will explain that is not his role. He's not the CIO. He's the one who's actually thinking about how can you make better use of that technology, and possibly how can you measure its effectiveness, because if everybody is remote, so is their technology usage remote. Over to you, Sebastian.
Absolutely. Thank you, Richard. Yeah, delighted to be here. Thanks for letting me join this call, which really has become an institution over these months. I'd like to bring 3 hypotheses regarding technology to this session today. First one being, I think we have recognized that technology is now a competitive differentiator, even in professional services, one might say. And the bad news is the time to invest is now still, even if you have already invested in going remote, etc. The second hypothesis is that I think we need to change the way we treat technology in firms. So we need to treat it as a revenue driver, not a cost position, which is really a fundamental difference. And that leads to the third hypothesis, where I think if you want to treat it as a revenue driver, it means you need a different technology business management approach and an integration with traditional management reporting. So regarding this first hypothesis, I think competitive differentiation through technology is a reality today. And I don't want to repeat, all the talk that we've probably had on these calls and many, many others regarding remote work and virtual engagement and all that. We will probably revisit those topics regularly from now on. But we also know that, the uncertainty is here to stay, the price sensitivity is here to stay. And there is a different expectation now in terms of how we work with clients and how our employees work. And that is here to stay. So the line of visibility, how work gets done, has dramatically changed within firms and how we interact with our clients. And I think when I look at the priority list that you presented earlier, Richard, I think technology plays a key role in many of these priorities. First and foremost, definitely operational performance, sales and marketing, etc. But I think most importantly is that the client experience has changed. And I think we're really bad at measuring experiences. We all know the little poll that shows up when we roll off a Zoom call or a Teams call, which asks us to rate with stars, etc. How did you perceive this call? Was the sound and video quality okay? You can ask yourself how many firms do that with every client interaction in terms of content. How did you like how we presented the content? How was the interaction? How did you find using our tools, etc.? And I think there's a lot we can learn from technology. And I think both our client and employee experiences with technology need to get to a stage where we consciously measure them and treat them as something that makes a difference from one firm to the next. And I can assure you it does. Both our employees and clients are telling us that. So using technology for that levels the playing field in many ways, I think. And the firms which are investing now in creating better client and employee experiences are setting the expectation bar for those who follow. And the bar is being set right now. So this is why I believe we still need to continue to invest, and way beyond to what has already happened over the past couple of months. I don't think it's a really good idea to wait for all of us to return to the offices so we don't have to invest. I think that's a really, really bad idea. And that leads to my second hypothesis. We need to treat technology as a revenue driver, not a cost position. We can see that over the past couple of years already, technology spent in professional service firms, and I think I'm talking really all segments here, has increased both in absolute and relative numbers. Gartner expects for our industry that we will have a continued 5 to 15% relative annual growth of technology spent. And that is factoring in the decreasing unit costs. So if we just say, okay, this is just a growing cost position, it's basically a race to the bottom. But if we think of technology really as a revenue enabler, it instills a different mindset within our firms, one that ultimately should lead us to us actually charging for technology, or if we want to spin it from another angle, at least consciously baking those costs into our service and subscription fees, delivery models, and therefore cost structures. And that means we need to include technology views in our firm's internal management reporting, which really is my third hypothesis, as I said in the beginning. So I believe in order to do that, we must build very different technology business management capabilities, really, to get to a thorough and really quantifiable understanding of how, for what, where, by whom, and how much technology is being used, which is obviously especially important if we somewhere down the line want to bill technology costs to our clients and pass that on. But I think the reality right now in many firms is one very far away from charging for technology. I know it's already a daunting challenge in many firms to really think of an IT department as something that is more than really a behind the scenes enabler, infrastructure provider, or service desk. But I think if we use the current developments, which in many firms means moving systems to the cloud, consciously rolling out tools to employees, if we treat this as an opportunity to actually get some measures in place that ultimately allow us to distribute IT costs across client engagements, across delivered client services or solutions, internal practice groups, we get to a place where we can really start managing technology consciously in the role that it's starting to play in our client interactions, in the way we work together, etc. So practically, that really means that IT organizations need to work together with the business in firms to develop service portfolios that are in business jargon, basically, that have unit and price measures, etc. And that really roll all the way up from the general ledger, the cost pool view, into the typical IT view, or the internal typical functional units you would have in a larger IT department, and then rolls up into applications and then ultimately client services, because that is the only way we can really consider technology costs in client proposals, ensure accurate billing, etc. And as Richard said, obviously size of KPMG allows us to do maybe a little bit more around that, also means more complexity. And I think with the state of technology today, it is also possible, and actually possibly a game changer for smaller firms as well.
Thanks a lot, Sebastian. That was a really great insight. And I'll ask Cameron to join us in a second, Francesca first, because I think Cameron has a business model, subscription-based, which is all around using technology to help professional firms and other clients be more effective in their relationship management, but that's another story. But Francesca, let's hear your thoughts today, and then I'll welcome Cameron's thoughts on how professional firms maybe use retainers stroke subscriptions around the tech, and then throw the advice in for free sometimes. That's another story. Francesca.
Yeah, and there's two great questions as well, which I'm sure we'll get a chance to pick up as we go along. Gosh, there's some really fantastic insights there. So let me just do a little scattergun, if that's okay, Richard. There's a couple of points that have come up. Picking up on the ECG points that were set up so nicely by Cameron, and that you need, if you don't measure, you just don't really have an opportunity to know how you're getting on. And you'd like to hope, wouldn't you, that we're at the stage where people kind of get why D&I matters so much, why diversity and inclusion is so important. We do an annual survey, and each year there's like a glacial movement, and you go, really? Do people not realise how important this is? It takes time, but as many of you'll know, there's lots of research to suggest, just on the gender balance side of things, never mind everything else, it might be 80 years before we get some kind of parity, and we'll all be dead. So let's do something before then, because it's a real shame not to be around to enjoy it. But one of the things I think is really powerful around diversity is diversity of thinking. You know, there's so much research to show if you're not diverse in your thinking at a board level, at a leadership level, you're missing a trick. You're not as commercial, and you'll be outperformed in the market by those that are. But I think for professional services, particularly when you're pitching to clients and new clients, if you're not going with a group of people who have some linkage, some resonance with the people you're pitching at, it's a real downside. If you're not diverse in the team you bring, they're looking at you going, what's going on here? You don't look like us. Are you even going to be able to understand our business? Because you don't have that same diversity that we've been trying to do. So forward-thinking businesses tend to be diverse. And if you turn up with an undiverse group with them that don't have that same level of thinking, you often have no empathy with that client, and you can't serve them as well. It's really that simple. Hugely agree with Lisa around flex, and that comes through. There's a brilliant article in The Economist this week, which is free to view. You just need to put your email in and you can get it, around how working from home and working in the office has radically changed. I'd highly recommend that. But it was really echoing what Lisa said around flexibility. And the way that businesses are going to have to flex. They aren't going to be able to offer a one-size-fits-all solution, because people have such different needs and different requirements. On the one end of the spectrum, some people can't wait to get back to the office and escape their home. Others would probably never want to go back again. And how do you manage that? But one of the things that we've been talking about is, if you say you can make your office available for use, and the team goes, oh yeah, let's all go back in, what happens for that one or two people who don't feel comfortable going back? So we're insisting all team meetings happen virtually, at least until the end of the year, so that no one feels obliged to go into the office for a team meeting. They might go into the office for other reasons. So I think it's hugely important to recognise that split. And great insight from Sebastian, of course, around how do you actually begin to measure the tech bit? And I think there are a lot of accountants who've been writing down that stuff, Sebastian, going, yeah, how do we actually get that measurement? And oh my Lord, we're miles off it, aren't we? I can't think of I bet there's not many organisations that are even close to being able to get that resonance. But isn't it interesting? I mean, the number of calls I go on every day, which is about 8 to 9, which is probably pretty common for all of you. And they all start the same. Can you hear me? I'm just going to put the dog out the back. Can you see the slides? Oh, the internet's gone down. The kids are on Netflix. All of that. And as a client experience, it's kind of warm and embracing, but equally you have to get to a stage where it's perhaps slicker. And I think as our clients begin to expect slightly different things of us, if you do have to invest in massive tech to do that, how do you share that cost and that burden? I thought it was very, very insightful as well. And I think we're just going to get better and better and better at it. But we are doing, as McKinsey would say, what used to take us 6 months, we're doing in 6 weeks. What used to take us 6 years to do, we're doing in 6 months. And that's the speed and agility we have to be embracing.
Thanks, Francesca. Cameron, again, and there's a question you may have picked up from Mike for Cameron regarding age and where that fits in, if you saw that question, Cameron. But just as someone who's organising a professional service firm which is based around tech and around subscriptions, and therefore not your traditional model, what's your sense as to some of the issues being raised by Sebastian?
It totally aligns with what we see in the marketplace and what we as a firm have had to do. I think if we had worked on more historical legacy models around, thinking about, the commerciality of, an initiative first, without tying in technology, without tying in fact, all areas of the business to arrive at the right direction, I don't think we would have succeeded. And COVID really has, I think, focused everyone's minds on how fast you actually have to pivot. And if you haven't got the right technology in place, you're doomed. Now, I've got a very practical example of that in that, as an organization, we're not a very large organization by any stretch of the imagination, but for a medium-sized organization with 3 or 4 locations around the world, having all of your workers, particularly if they're in Chennai, having to suddenly work remotely could be a significant undertaking. And technology really did play a role in ensuring that where you have environments that don't necessarily have all of the high-speed links, technology helps you. And it helps you from the infrastructure standpoint, it helps you from a product development standpoint, and more importantly, it helps you empathize with your clients to say, particularly in the professional services community, we are trying to do this. Have you come across this situation before? And we're in the fortunate position that we can do so, and not give advice, but certainly help them arrive at the right solution. So hopefully that answers the viewpoint from my perspective, Richard. And I noticed we've got a question come in around age and diversity, and I think it's a really good question, because actually it's something that interestingly came up for us around about 4 months ago. We've been very, very involved in gender diversity for many years, and have recently been moving, like many organizations, to embrace all areas of diversity. The interesting part, when we started to analyze our data, which focuses a lot on people, one of the things that really started to throw up was age. And what is the right distribution of age at all levels? And I think you cannot say that having a board that is made up of an average age of 60, 65 is absolutely the right thing, because it really is not. Increasingly, what we're seeing is the more dynamic, successful companies that are really beginning to push forward are emulating what you see coming out of the West Coast of America, where you do have a mix. You have highly experienced board members that have spent 30 years in a particular industry, bring a lot of experience to the board. But you also have people that are maybe in their 30s who are bringing new ideas to the board. But more importantly, they're bringing new ideas into the leadership team. So diversity of age absolutely is something we should be considering. And it's something that we've been looking at in terms of the different themes around diversity. It is all too easy, I think, to focus just in on a particular aspect. Everything's important. I think everyone should be treated fairly. And I think that should be thrown into the mix in terms of any policy decision. So I hope that answers that question.
And Richard, perhaps
Thanks.
I could jump.
Yeah,
Richard,
go in.
perhaps I could jump in, because I know 100% agree with that. And I think there's some very interesting experiments people have done. Many leadership teams or senior leadership teams are exactly that, really senior. And I know a couple of law firms in particular inverted their structure and put some of their sort of 30, 40 people in their senior leadership team, and almost released some of their older experienced individuals to go back to client-facing roles to give a different dynamic, a different experience mix. And I think your point around mix is really crucial. It's about having that range of people, that diversity of age, that diversity of experience. And as I just said to Mike on my reply to the question, the older I get, the more important I think age might be. But there's a massive piece here around not everybody looking the same, not in that same group think that can often happen in leadership groups who look the same, sound the same, think the same, because that's when you often run into all sorts of difficulties.
Yeah, and there's also, it's interesting if you think about America for a minute, people are of counsel in law firms mainly because their clients haven't really retired either. Whereas in the UK, I think the average age for retirement for PwC is 53 or something like that. Lisa, perhaps I could bring you in on this one. There's a question from Len regarding optics, and should you be promoting your things like a great place to work results to clients? I think I kind of know where you're going to come from on that one, but more perhaps differently, when you look at your Yorkshire law firms, your leaders, to what extent are they bringing people who are not partners into those leadership discussions?
Yeah,
internally?
I did see that question. I mean, you and I are on the same page, I think, with this one. I definitely think there should be those kind of surveys that are talking about the sentiment of the employees and how they're feeling and what is the environment that they're working in. And I definitely think it's a massive selling point to put into pictures. I don't know why you wouldn't do that. People want to deal with an engaged team. Of course they do. And there's nothing worse than low energy levels and actually people being negative or critical of their own firm. And that does happen, unfortunately. So definitely in terms of the promotion of it, and I know that, we work together, team morale is really important for the Managing Partners Forum. In terms of, it's interesting, I completely agree with you about the diversity issue, but how difficult it is in the more traditional firms where they still keep the board as the equity owners, then inevitably the age range is higher. And actually in lots of firms, it's not as positive a proposition to say buy into this firm in the present day. So there may be some of those younger people aren't necessarily thinking they want to be fixed to buy that equity. So it's quite difficult. It really works when they then do have a separate management team umbrella, senior leadership team, when it gives them that flexibility. But it's not always easy to turn around to a senior equity partner and tell them that you don't think they should be having the discussions that are kind of everyday and operational. It's sensitive. There's lots of elephants in lots of rooms there, I think.
Yeah, I mean, what I've seen in some firms is they kind of say, well, actually, a lot of the issues which are being discussed aren't probably that relevant to, say, the millennials, but there are certain elements within our discussions that absolutely are. So we'll have a shadow board is one route that some people do, where the shadow board of millennials discuss the same issues independently of the main board, and then the two kind of compare notes. That works quite well. I've also seen subcommittees which perhaps don't work quite as well, but the shadow boards is something I think certainly seen works quite well, and I would encourage firms, because reality is a lot of issues will not be as important to the millennial generation. Sebastian, again, picking up measurement, and I was quite interested where we were talking here about measurement of tech usage and effectiveness. I mean, that, accountants and auditors will audit anything. I mean, do you think that's a new revenue stream for firms to measure the technology effectiveness of other organizations?
Well, I have to say, I think it's already happening. That industry already exists, and so we didn't really have to reinvent the wheel. There's actually open source standards around managing technology costs and how to account for them, etc. That are really helpful along those lines. So I would say the business is already there. I think it's just really interesting, in a people-based business like ours, that all of this is all of a sudden becoming so relevant, such a relevant cost position, such a relevant part of the experience we deliver, that I think for us, we need to rethink how we incorporate that. And I think the big change is more really for a people-based industry like ours to adjust our management playbook to, how do we treat people and technology in the picture, and understand how those factors work together. So to me, that's more of the question here than let's say getting the numbers right.
Perfect. Well, look, I think we now have reached that magic hour, sadly, when we have to say goodbye to our panel and thank them hugely for their time, effort, and energy. People don't just come on for 5 minutes and sort of make it up as you go along, and there's a lot of preparation involved. And thank you for that, everybody, hugely. We've got another show next week with a different set of people coming through, which will be fun. We'll be looking at Casper Craven and his sailing adventure, and we'll also be looking at Rob Archer and the psychology of going back to the office, and what are the things that are going on in people's minds that management has to be aware of. So hopefully that should be of interest to the group. Thank you for all staying with us again, as usual. It's great. For those of you who have found the new way in a little bit more complex, we're obviously looking to improve that as we go along. So do give me your feedback on that one. As always, if you have missed this or you want to share it, then all the videos you'll find in the management library. And it only really remains me to say, I hope you found today helpful. And there's a bit.ly code there. So if you do want to encourage others to self-book, and that's the key word now, self-book for future episodes, then that's where to go. So on behalf of the panel, I'd like to thank you all for today's show, and hopefully you find it useful, interesting. The poll will be turned into a diagnostic. So in a week or two, you'll be able to go in and find out how do you share how did you fare against your peer group, which again, I think is something that people are finding increasingly interesting, as we're all, at the end of the day, most interested in what other professional firms are up to. Sadly, that's kind of what drives us. But that what makes the show work as well. So I'll leave you to that. Have a happy, great weekend when you get there. And thanks again. Bye for now.